each of us with our own unique abilities and challenges, preferences and dreams. A diversity that should be reflected across our school systems. But for many, it is not.
मी विचार केला की जर मोठ्या घरचे लोक शिकू शकतात तर आपण का नाही शिकू शकत. माझी तर इच्छा होती. त्याच्यानंतर हा पण विचार आला की माझ्या आई-वडिलांनी वर्षानुवर्ष रस्त्यावरती राहून काढले. मग त्यांना पण माझी इच्छा होती की त्यांना पण असं म्हणजे सगळे घरामध्ये राहतात. मला पण
Sorry. My apologies.
We live in a world where no two people are the same. Each of us with our own unique abilities and challenges, preferences and dreams. A diversity that should be reflected across our school systems. But for many, it is not.
मी विचार केला की जर मोठ्या घरचे लोक शिकू शकतात तर आपण का नाही शिकू शकत. माझी तर इच्छा होती. त्याच्यानंतर हा पण विचार आला की माझ्या आई-वडिलांनी वर्षानुवर्ष रस्त्यावरती राहून काढले. मग त्यांना पण माझी इच्छा होती की त्यांना पण असं म्हणजे सगळे घरामध्ये राहतात. मला पण इच्छा आहे की मी पण एक स्वतःचा रूम घेईल शिकून मोठी झाल्यावरती.
By 2030, we aim to achieve inclusive education for all, no matter the region, income, or challenge ahead. This is the decade of action, and together we must ensure that all really does mean all in every classroom. To achieve true inclusion, we will need to place students' differences at the core of our education systems, understanding them as strengths to be celebrated, not as problems to be solved. From children to policymakers, parents to principals, everyone will need to get involved. Countries will need to understand the challenges and underlying disadvantages facing their students and directly address each individual's multi-layered needs. Inclusion cannot be achieved one group at a time. It requires more and better data on those being excluded from education to make the invisible visible again.
Accurate data is important for everything as a great starting point.
To make data come alive for action, you need these very lively and sustained partnerships.
But simply moving students from special schools into mainstream schools that lack the appropriate resources will not work. It requires a complete shift in systems and teachers that are well trained with the right learning materials and assessments to meet the needs of their students.
Guter Unterricht ist für uns kooperativer Unterricht, in dem Schüler auch gemeinsam Probleme lösen, nicht immer nur der Lehrer gefragt ist. Das heißt, ich verlasse meinen Status der allwissenden Lehrperson.
We need to break down preconceptions about particular groups to ensure that all children feel welcome in school and have the chance to thrive.
We believe that everybody at the lab is an agent of transformation. Some of them report that the lab gave them a voice. We help them in this way as to become protagonists, to awaken their potential.
Across the world, governments and policymakers will need to ensure equitable financing. Allocating these resources to children that are the furthest behind will need to be planned jointly.
Partnership cannot be overemphasized. So you may not be a health person, but you may be an administrator, you may be an innovator. We can put all of these to the table and then make it work.
The path ahead will have its challenges, but working together, learning from our peers, we can ensure that all means all, and every child has the chance to reach their full potential.
All countries committed to inclusive education when they signed up for SDG 4 to be achieved by 2030. And it's a commitment we can't afford to lose sight of. Even in the light of COVID-19, if anything, the case for it has become stronger. We at the report, we refer to inclusion as a process that embraces diversity and builds a sense of belonging to achieve social cohesion. And these actions are rooted in the belief that every person has value and potential. It is about neither discriminating against nor rejecting anyone. It's about adapting to learners, making accommodations, but not about learners adapting to the system. The case for inclusion has been championed by those supporting the rights of people with disabilities who ensure the right to inclusive education is guaranteed in international law. But inclusion is not about just one group. The mindset and the mechanisms that generate discrimination and rejection are the same for all those excluded. So every society needs to own up to their mechanisms that exclude. Identity, background, and abilities still dictate education opportunities. Any discussion of inclusion has to start from the 258 million children, adolescents, and youth who are out of school entirely. In 12 countries, children with disabilities are 2.5 times more likely never to go to school than their peers. Adolescent refugees are 3 times more likely to be out of secondary school. The world set a target for all to complete secondary school by 2030, but in at least 20 countries, hardly any poor rural women do complete secondary. Stigma, stereotypes, and discrimination mean that millions are alienated inside classrooms and less likely to progress. Grade 4 students not learning their home language are 34% less likely to learn basic reading skills. These are just some of the examples, some of the groups who suffer exclusion in education and where we can see the consequences of that. Some of these inequalities have been made worse or exposed further through the crisis in education created by COVID-19. We already heard that at the height of school closures, 90% of students around the world were out of school. Yet 40% of poor countries didn't target learners at risk specifically in their education response. At the global level, education aid may take 6 years to recover to 2018 levels. And that's even though the pandemic has actually increased the funding gap. Looking at the region we're in here, the first most response in many school systems has been a switch to remote learning. And we see that in Gulf states, the schools are actually quite well equipped. 100% of schools have internet connection. But that doesn't mean, if we look at the right-hand graph, that doesn't mean it can be assumed that everyone in the population, all the families, are actually well prepared or well equipped to take advantage of that. Still, only around half of people have actually downloaded, installed, or configured software at the population level. So that's a gap that needs to be bridged. Our key overarching recommendation in the report is for all of those involved to education to understand it as broadly as possible, as really referring to everyone. Inclusion cannot be achieved if it's seen as an inconvenience, or if people harbor the belief that children's capacity to learn is fixed or limited in fixed ways by their characteristics. So the report calls on all countries to widen the understanding of inclusive education to encompass all learners, regardless of identity, background, or ability. So this report is for everyone. It refers to all countries, the albinos in sub-Saharan Africa, stateless in Arab countries, the Roma in Europe, the displaced Rohingya in Asia, Afro-descendants in Latin America. Yet many governments do not base their laws and policies on that principle. The report found that only around 2/3 of countries have a definition of inclusive education, and even fewer actually have a definition that covers multiple marginalized groups. In the Northern Africa and Western Asia region, it's fewer than half of countries with a broad definition of inclusive education. And in a quarter of countries, the definition of inclusive education only covers people with disabilities or special needs. We have 8 more specific recommendations that you find a wealth of material in the report. I will only be able to briefly enumerate them here. One is that inclusion isn't costly by definition. There are simple gestures and ways to manage classrooms that cost nothing, but that make valuable contributions to inclusion. But yet, of course, this has to be supplemented through adequate funding. both central funding, general funding, but also targeted funding that really reaches those most in need. There's no one ideal funding mechanism. Countries vary in history, in their understanding of inclusive education and the levels of decentralization. Still, there's something to learn from examples of countries that are moving away from assigning funding by the type of need or funding tied to special needs diagnoses, which may inflate the number of students who are identified like that. Related to the funding, in a quarter of countries, laws still call for students with disabilities to be educated in separate settings. Another 48% of countries call for at least partial segregation. Now, this legacy of segregation means that human and material resources to support diversity have been concentrated in a few places and are unequally distributed. This creates a planning and management challenge. Mechanisms and incentives are needed to share specialist resources and ensure that such expertise supports all mainstream schools. Consultation with parents and communities is key because still many do not believe that inclusion is possible and desirable. Some 15% of parents in Germany and 59% in Hong Kong feared that children with disabilities would disrupt others' learning. So many parents prefer the feeling of familiarity or exclusivity that some schools offer. And school choice can therefore exacerbate a tendency to self-segregate. The report refers to several examples, for example, in Chile by income, in Lebanon along sectarian lines, or in Malaysia by ethnicity. And parents of vulnerable children may also have genuine fears that their children are not well served in mainstream schools. Parents and communities should be able to voice such concerns and be invited to contribute to the design of policies on inclusion in education to really create full support. And partnership and cooperation is key also across sectors, across ministries. The education ministry must work with other ministries to share data on disadvantaged children and to integrate services using common standards. But worldwide, norms and bureaucratic working cultures prevent, in many cases, such coordinated service delivery. In Jordan, the two main government bodies responsible for people with disabilities had different ways of accrediting special schools, for example, undermining efforts to promote inclusion. A new 10-year strategy there will address this issue. We have a good example from Oman, where a national coordination team aims to mainstream child-friendly education across all levels. But it also means cooperation across between central governments and local governments, for example, so that education ministries ensure that local authorities who have the mandate to provide inclusive services are also fully funded and have the capacity they need. Room must be made for non-government actors. A range of NGOs have played a key role in making the case for inclusion in societies. Firstly, many NGOs are advocates and watchdogs for the right to inclusive education. They monitor progress on government commitments, they defend against rights violations, and they campaign for inclusive policies. So governments should create conditions enabling NGOs to play this role. Elsewhere, NGOs actively provide education services to groups such as out of the reach of the government, such as street children, or they provide alternatives. Universal design for learning is a powerful concept for making products and services usable for all people. In education, UDL has been associated with accessible school buildings and flexible learning environments, but it goes far beyond that. And these are not issues for any one country. The teachers everywhere have a key role to play in creating inclusive classrooms, but around a quarter of teachers in middle and high income countries reported a need for further professional development on teaching students with special needs. Teachers themselves are not immune to social bias either, so their education needs to tackle entrenched views and biases of some students as being unable to learn. And head teachers need to communicate an inclusive school ethos. When we come to data, what data are collected and how they are used determines whether inclusion is served by the data collection. On the one hand, identifying groups makes disadvantaged groups visible, helping to prompt action. But doing so can also reduce children to labels, creating self-fulfilling prophecies. But countries such as Portugal have shown that a non-categorical approach to determining special needs is possible. Some progress has been made in terms of data collection. Kenya added a new ethnic group category as well as intersex as a gender option in its 2019 census. And the measurement of disability is catching up with the social concept of disability through the Washington Group's questions and the child functioning module in UNICEF's mixed surveys. But large discrepancies remain. Some countries do not capture even basic data. Cameroon and Nigeria had no enrollment data on children with visual impairments. Others go much further. New Zealand monitors whether students feel cared for and if they maintain positive relationships, for example. Looking at the question of data, if we try to learn something about lower secondary school completion among the rural poor, for example, if we go to the UIS database, then for the Gulf countries, we actually find no data at all. That's because such information requires on household surveys where coverage is poorest in the Northern Africa and Western Asia region. We see that in terms of population, this is the region that really has the lowest coverage of the regional population with household survey data. Still, some things we do know. If we look at progress towards SDG 4 in the region, there's a wide range in terms of minimum proficiency in mathematics. We see it ranges from only 10% to 46% or so. On the bright side, the percentage of out-of-school children at upper secondary is relatively low in the region compared to the world average, the regional average. In pre-primary education is again relatively high in the region. Tertiary education, as before, it shows quite a range, but interestingly, we see that it's not the same countries necessarily that perform well at different levels. We spoke about the need for financing and improving the financing. There are two benchmarks for international spending on education. One is that governments should spend at least 4% of GDP. Another is that they should spend at least 15% of their overall government expenditure. We see that most countries in the region actually miss both benchmarks and are spending far too low, too little on education, however you look at it. Now, we are excited to launch a new website, Peer, that I'm sure all of you will, with an interest in comparative education, at some point have asked yourselves, how does country X or Y approach one or another issue in education policy? The Peer website aims to address this and fulfill our mandate to monitor national SDG 4 strategies. In this first edition, we've included profiles describing how every country approaches inclusion in education through its laws and policies. And we use these profiles to map trends on selected issues and by region. So what we found, for example, interesting examples here from the region on inclusive education policies, Dubai with the strongest inclusive education policy in the region, for example, but also more targeted examples of policies. So Peer allows us to produce, to identify how many countries have a definition of inclusion that covers all learners, how many only target people with disabilities by comparison, and how many of those require learners with disabilities to be educated in separate settings. And we see that in the region, there is still too little explicit policy that promotes inclusion of persons with disabilities in mainstream schools. We're already working on our profiles for our 2021 report, which will focus on how countries regulate non-state actors in education. And the concept note was launched last December. The online consultation continues though. And as I mentioned, PEER will feature country profiles on this topic. To complement the 2021 GEM report. We are developing a typology of non-state actors for that and documenting what information we find on regulation. There will be other themes coming up, other profiles. And one message I want to send out to the audience today is to please help us with that effort, engage and partner with us in making sure that the information on your countries in these profiles is complete and comprehensive and accurate. That's all the time I have today. I look forward to the interesting discussion and I thank you very much for your attention.
نشكر الدكتور بلال بركات على تفضله في هذا العرض القيم والشامل للتقرير. والآن سوف يقادر سعادة الوزير نظراً لارتباطاته. وسنبدأ الآن مع الحلقة النقاشية سيقدمها الفاضل دانيال بادلة من مكتب اليونسكو في الدوحة، ونود تذكيركم بأنه يمكن استخدام خانة الأسئلة لمشاركتنا بملاحظاتكم واستفساراتكم.
Thanks, Lulwa, for the introduction. Hello and good morning from Doha. I'm really pleased to welcome you to the second part of today's program to discuss the barriers to achieving inclusion education, as highlighted in the 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report, and as mentioned by previous speakers. I think the messages from His Excellency, the Minister of Education and Higher Education, the Director of the UNESCO Office for the Gulf States and Yemen, as well as Dr. Bilal Barakat could not have been clearer that it is really very important to ensure that everyone has an equal opportunity for quality learning. The objective of this session is to increase awareness of the different aspects of inclusive education, stimulate policy dialogue, and identify gaps and explore cross-sectoral partnerships and solutions. This is particularly important to the task of building back better in the COVID-19 era to ensure all children and youth living and learning in the Gulf states receive the education they deserve. Joining me this morning are 8 distinguished panelists who will provide insights and discuss the status of inclusive education in the Gulf region. More specifically, we will be hearing from them about at-risk and out-of-school children, child protection and psychosocial well-being, amongst many other important issues. We will also be hearing about specific country experiences and examples of promoting inclusive education. So let me now introduce our panelists. The first one is Dr. Mary Pigozzi, who is the Executive Director of Educate a Child, Education Above All Foundation. As Executive Director of Educate a Child for the past 8 years, Dr. Pigozzi brings a wealth of experience to the discussion on the issue of reaching out-of-school children around the world. Next, we have Dr. Yahia Al-Agha, Director of Al-Salam School in Qatar, an initiative of Education Above All and the Ministry of Education and Higher Education. Al-Salam schools cater specifically to formerly out-of-school children and youth in Qatar. Next is Mr. Anthony MacDonald, Head of Office and Senior Program Manager, UNESCO Qatar Office. Mr. MacDonald has over 20 years of experience in policy development, advocacy and program management in child protection, early childhood development, human rights, and international development. We then have Ms. Hana Yoshimoto, Chief of Education and Senior Education Specialist at the UNESCO Regional Bureau of Education for the Arab States in Beirut. Recently, she's leading the UNESCO's coordination efforts for the education response in Yemen, alongside partners such as UNICEF, WFP, the World Bank, and the Islamic Development Bank. We then have Dr. Ahmed Al-Emadi, Dean of the College of Education at Qatar University. As you may probably know, Qatar University College of Education offers the country's premier education degree and produces thousands of new teachers each year. We will then call on Dr. Ziyad Najem, Vice President and CEO of KFAS Academy. KFAS stands for the Kuwait Foundation for the Advancement of Sciences. Dr. Ziyad has been entrusted with the production of online and digital content for education and professional development in the state of Kuwait. We will then have Ms. Amna Al-Balushi, who is the Assistant Secretary General of Oman National Commission for UNESCO and National Coordinator of Oman's Associated Schools Project Network, or ASPNet. And finally, we will call Mr. Abdullah Al-Mansouri, Director of Qatar Career Development Center. Mr. Al-Mansouri has been the director of the QCDC since 2008. Its mission is to help unlock the country's human potential by preparing youth to respond to the requirements of Qatar's National Vision 2030. A very warm welcome to you all. Just a couple of reminders before we begin. To all the panelists, you have 5 minutes to respond to the question that I will be asking you, and you have a few more during the Q&A that follows. To all participants and those joining us virtually this morning, please send us your questions using the Q&A function, which can be found at the bottom of your screen. We will try to respond to as many questions as possible towards the end, but please be very brief and also indicate the name of the panelist to whom your question is addressed. So now let me start with Dr. Pigosi. Dr. Pigosi, as Executive Director of Educate a Child, the organization responsible for realizing Sheikh Moses' objective to reach 10 million out-of-school primary school age children, you have a wealth of experience in the kinds of challenges of facing governments, schools, and communities when it comes to access to quality education. The GEM report itself and UIA's data show that the numbers of out-of-school children in the Gulf states are low in comparison to other parts of the world, but still they exist. What would you say are the key obstacles in this part of the world to ensuring all children and youth are engaged in schooling and reaching expected learning outcomes, especially during the disruptions that we have seen as a result of COVID-19? The floor is yours, Dr. Pigosi.
Thank you. Your Excellency, the Minister of Education and Higher Education of the State of Qatar. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in the launch of this very important GEM report, which addresses inclusion, a topic that's at the core of the mandate of the Education Above All Foundation and its program, Educate a Child. This question of high-income countries in our region and their out-of-school children populations is probably a topic that many people do not want to hear about, either because other high-income countries do not want to admit that they have pockets of out-of-school children, or other countries do not want the focus to be on countries that they believe have sufficient internal resources to address their problems. Regardless, let's dig a little deeper and look at the out-of-school challenges facing the high-income countries. There are challenges facing both the countries themselves and out-of-school children. First, in high-income countries that normally have high enrollment rates, those who are out of school are virtually invisible. There are relatively few of them, as been noted, and they are not usually in the same arenas as their wealthier counterparts. If they're not seen, they're not noticed. They may be children living in the outskirts of cities, children of low-wage employed workers, youth who are out of school because they're working, refugees, or displaced children. They're with us, but they're not visible. So why don't we see them? They face a multitude of barriers, but there are solutions that can be adapted to our context. Here are some examples that I could talk about. Due to extreme poverty, there may be insufficient funds just to pay for school fees. In places like Syria and Yemen, even if school is available, the journey to school is probably not safe. Identity and background often end up being discriminators in our region, albeit unintentionally. Syria is a good example of where psychosocial support and recreational activities have had quite a bit of success in addressing some of the negative outputs of conflict. When the education on offer is not seen as relevant, we need to address things such as teacher development, which has been used in Syria and Turkey, or educational materials as have been provided in Iraq, Syria, and Jordan. Sometimes it is something as simple as the lack of facilities, as is the case in Iraq. We know a whole lot, but let's then layer COVID-19 over all of this. The pandemic has left several important marks on our region. It has laid bare inequalities that were less visible before. At some point, it made all our learners in all education institutions feel excluded because of school closing. We know that even these temporary disruptions can have severe effects. Think about what it is like for those who have been permanently excluded. The pandemic has shown that distance education is not simply about access to and the use of technology. It's more complex. And the pandemic has demonstrated to all of us, and especially parents, how complex and time-consuming and important education is. This pandemic has certainly given non-educators a very different view of the value of education. Yes, we're in a crisis, but this crisis has shown in stark reality where we all need to work in order to change the education that we provide so we can include everyone. Here are some practical actions that we can put in place in this region. First, make those invisible children visible. Start by counting all children, not only those who are in school. Remember, a child only counts when she is counted. Our education data systems need to start with a baseline of all children in the country, and then count which ones of those are enrolled. Second, we do know a lot. We know that inclusion is possible, even in conflict zones or when children have learning disabilities. There is plenty of evidence. We just need to apply it. Thirdly, we must target financing to those who are left behind. When we reach them, we reach everyone. Yes, we're in a crisis, but we have the knowledge and other resources to address it and use them in this region to build more inclusive education systems. We must do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pigozzi. Really very compelling, presentation. And really, I like the idea of, what you said about making the invisible visible, especially in our context. Thank you very much. Now, I would like to call on Dr. Yahia of the Al Salam schools in Doha. As you know, these schools are a great initiative and fully supported by the Ministry of Education and Higher Education and Education above all. Can you tell us a bit more about the kind of students who are enrolled at your school and the challenges they have faced with their education? And why has it been necessary to establish these schools in Qatar? And what advice would you give to other Gulf states about reaching out-of-school children? The floor is yours, Dr. Yahia.
Okay, thank you very much for all. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. بداية أرحب بالجميع معالي الدكتور محمد عبد الواحد الحمادي الدكتورة أنا بوليني مدير مكتب اليونسكو الإقليمي بالدوحة، وأرحب بالجميع من خلال مكتبة مدرسة السلام. يعني أنا الآن أتحدث إليكم من داخل المكتبة الخاصة بالمدرسة التي أصبحت جزءاً من منظومة التعليم بدولة قطر بعد مرور عامين متواصلين على إنشاء هذه المدرسة. هذه المدرسة جاءت تعاون وثيق جداً بين وزارة التعليم والتعليم العالي والتعليم فوق الجميع، وكذلك مكتب اللجنة الوطنية القطرية للتربية والثقافة والعلوم كما تفضلت. وقد شاركت أكثر من جهة أخرى فاعلة من ضمنها وزارة الصحة العامة وكذلك وزارة الداخلية ومكتبة قطر الوطنية ومؤسسات خيرية وغيرها من الجهات الداعمة وأشخاص اعتباريين قاموا بالمساهمة بدعم هذه المدرسة في أمور كثيرة. أيضا لدعم هذه المدرسة تفضل سعادة الدكتور محمد عبد الواحد الحمادي وزير التعليم والتعليم العالي بافتتاح هذه المدرسة في شهر فبراير مع عدد من المسؤولين من جهات مختلفة بالدولة وخاصة قطر الخيرية والتعليم فوق الجميع إلى آخره من الجهات من المسؤولين. عدد الطلاب بهذه المدرسة الآن يعني اليوم الإحصائية الأخيرة 594 طالب وطالبة يدرسون على فترتين. الفترة الأولى تبدأ من الساعة 7 صباحا إلى الساعة 12:30 ظهرا. الفترة الثانية تبدأ من الساعة 2 وحتى الساعة 7 مساء. هؤلاء الطلاب يتعلمون المنهاج القطري في ظروف بيئية مناسبة لجميع الطلاب والطالبات. أيضا متوفر لدى الطلاب والطالبات هيئة إدارية وتعليمية متميزة تم تدريبهم تدريبا متميزا حتى يستطيعوا جميعا أن يتناسبوا في إيصال المعلومة للطلاب وحتى يتعرفوا على مشاكلهم النفسية واستطاعوا فعلا أن يصلوا إلى ما يريدون من نتائج إيجابية بالنسبة للطلاب والطالبات. هؤلاء الطلاب جميعا ينتمون إلى 14 جنسية أو 14 جنسية، يغلب عليهم كما تفضلتم الجنسية السورية للأسباب التي تعرفونها. أيضا تضم هذه المدرسة بين طلابها ذوي الاحتياجات الخاصة البسيطة، وهذا ترسيخا لمبدأ التعليم الشامل للجميع الذي نحن بصدده اليوم. يتعلمون هنا المنهاج القطري ويتم توفير كافة الاحتياجات لهم دون تمييز، زي المدرسي، الكتب المدرسية، المواصلات من وإلى البيت، المتابعة الصحية سواء في المراكز الصحية بالدولة أو سواء داخل المدرسة. لدينا مكتب صحي خاص بهؤلاء الطلاب في الفترتين الصباحية والمسائية. بكل صدق لقد واجهنا الجميع تحديات كبيرة سواء كان من وزارة التعليم والتعليم العالي أو التعليم فوق الجميع أو من اللجنة الوطنية للتربية والثقافة والعلوم للوصول إلى هذه الفئة في أماكن إقامتهم. وكانت اللجنة الوطنية قد طرحت سؤالا: كم عدد الطلاب الذين هم خارج منظومة التعليم؟ ما مستوياتهم العلمية؟ ما جنسياتهم؟ أين يسكنون في مساحة دولة قطر 11,000 كيلومتر مربع؟ وهل يمكن تجميعهم في مدرسة واحدة أو في مدارس مختلفة؟ هذه أسئلة راودت اللجنة الوطنية للتربية والثقافة والعلوم الدكتورة حمدة إلى أن تم الوصول إلى نتائج إيجابية لهذا الموضوع بإنشاء هذه المدرسة التي نحن بصددها والتي أجلس الآن في مكتبتها كما قلت. واجهتنا تحديات أخرى تتمثل في أن هؤلاء الطلاب القادمين من أماكن الحروب والويلات والمشاكل الكثيرة في بعض الدول، عدم امتلاك الطلاب للشهادات العلمية التي تثبت أنهم كانوا بالمدارس بسبب كما قلت الحروب وغيرها من الأسباب. فكان لابد من إجراء امتحانات تقييمية للطلاب من خلال وزارة التعليم والتعليم العالي وصولا إلى تحديد الفصل الدراسي الذي يتناسب مع عمر الطالب النظامي، أو إذا كان عمره أعلى من العمر النظامي يمكن أن يتم إدراجه في قائمة تسمى قائمة المنازل. هذا ممكن أن يدرس في البيت، ولكن في أيام العطل ممكن أن يأتي للمدرسة أو يراجع الأستاذ عن طريق الواتساب أو طرائق أخرى المختلفة حتى يصل إلى المعلومة التي يريدها هذا الطالب. هناك تعاون وثيق من جميع الجهات وصولا إلى ما نحن عليه الآن. واجهنا تحدي آخر: هناك عديد من الطلاب انتهت صلاحيات جواز سفرهم ولا يوجد سفارات تجدد لهم هذه الجوازات، أو أن إقاماتهم انتهت وبالتالي لا يمكن اعتماد تسجيله في سجلات الوزارة. فكان لابد من تعاون وثيق وكان هذا مع وزارة الداخلية القطرية التي استجابت لهذا التحدي الكبير، فأصدرت أرقاما مؤقتة لتصحيح الوضع لهم، وتم ذلك بدون أن يشعر حتى ولي الأمر أننا قمنا بهذا.
I'm sorry, Dr. Yahia, but we have to conclude. Thank you. Thank you, please. Yeah, we need to conclude soon. Thank you.
Yes. Yes. نصيحة yes. الأول نصائح. أرى بإصدار القوانين التي تجرم كل طالب خارج منظومة التعليم في الدولة التي يعيش على أرضها. 2. وضع تشريعات تكفل بضمان قبولهم في الدراسة حسب الدراسة المسحية للحالات. وضع السياسات العامة والخاصة. العامة أقصد بها ما يتصل بتفاصيل العمل الكاملة، والخاصة حسب معطيات كل دولة، ولكن بضمان القبول في الدراسة مع تهيئة بيئة تعليمية مناسبة للدارسين بشكل متوازن مع أقرانهم في المدارس الأخرى. مساعدة أولياء الأمور، وهذا الذي نقوم به الآن، بطرائق تربوية وعلمية لتجاوز الحاجز النفسي الذي يحول دون متابعة أبنائهم للدراسة من خلال تدريبهم على أجهزة الحاسوب والإنترنت ليكونوا عونا لأبنائهم، وخاصة فيما يتصل بجائحة كورونا وبالعكس. ضمان مشاركة مجتمعية وحكومية داعمة بشكل سخي لاستمرارية وديمومة العملية التعليمية للمدرسة حتى النهاية. وأخيرا أرى بضرورة اعتماد استراتيجية التعليم الشامل للجميع لمن هم في عمر الدراسة كمنطلق من أصحاب القرار النافذين لضمان استمراريته مع المتابعة الميدانية.
Thank you, Dr. Yahia. I'm sorry, but we're really running out of time. I really have to stop you there, and we will do the Q&A later. Thank you so much. I'm really sorry to stop you there. Next, we have Mr. Anthony McDonald, who is the, as like mentioned earlier, the Senior Program Manager and
this meeting is being recorded.
UNICEF Doha office. As you know, UNICEF leads the United Nations in issues of child protection, including the psychosocial well-being of children around the world. But when people hear the term inclusive education, they often think only of children with disabilities and the ways that schools should be built and organized to allow full participation of those children. But as the GEM report points out, for education to be truly inclusive, it also needs to respond to other kinds of differences and challenges facing learners. So could you elaborate on these less well-known aspects of inclusive education? And as follow-up, what more can schools and teachers in the Gulf states be doing to ensure schools are safe spaces, which is all the more important during this pandemic? The floor is yours, Mr. McDonald.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you so much for the Ministry of Education, Higher Education, and for UNESCO for inviting us to be part of this important report. So to get to the point straight away, because we don't have much time, prioritizing children's safety and psychosocial well-being, as you said, in schools and as part of the broader learning experience is a critical part of inclusive education. Ensuring that homes and schools are a safe haven for children is also a key part of inclusion, especially amidst the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on children. And we've seen across the world since the start of the pandemic, UNICEF has seen an increase in reports of physical and psychological violence against children in schools, but also in the home. And it's therefore important that teachers, parents are not only more aware of this, but that they put in place measures to prevent further harm to children.
The recording has stopped.
Additionally, UNICEF, and this is what I want to focus on the last few minutes, has developed a teacher preparedness and training package to support ministries of education, educators, teachers, students, parents, to ensure that schools and homes are equipped for children to be safe so that they can survive and thrive at all times, wherever they're learning. And as you know, with the pandemic, more and more children are learning at school, but they're also learning at home. So it's ensuring that both the home environment and the school environment provide a safe area of learning, including the internet and digital environment as well. So the teacher preparedness and training package has a number of key modules. And module 1 is about the safe school operations. Module 3 is very much about the learning itself, the content of the learning experience. And all of that is something that most governments tend to focus on. And they focus a lot on this, but one of the areas that we have found throughout the world is that perhaps there's less focus on children and teachers' well-being and their protection, both in the school environment and in the home environment, which are the two main areas where they're learning, as well as in the digital environment as well. So these three spheres of learning. So one of the things that we are trying to do is through the teacher preparedness and training package, which is very much developed with the assumption that schools have already opened and that they provide low-tech solutions to be able to support teachers and learners wherever they are to ensure that their safety and well-being is ensured. So I just want to focus a few minutes and highlight some of the benefits of the second module, which really focuses on the well-being and protection of teachers and students. The aim of the teacher preparedness and training package is very much to build resilience, not just of teachers, not just of students and parents, but of the entire education and learning system. And we know that lockdown is arguably the largest psychological experiment ever conducted, wrote a famous health psychologist, Van Hoof, of Free University in Brussels. And at one point, roughly 1/3 of the planet's population were under orders to stay at home. And that means 2.6 billion more than were alive during World War II were experiencing the emotional and financial impacts of this new virus. Even the most proven resilient individuals took its toll as a result of COVID. And it will, many have described it as or a warning against the mental illness or a tsunami of mental illness. So the key objective of the training package is to strengthen and build resilience both in the student, the teachers, but also the entire education system. And this is something very much echoed in our meetings with the Ministry of Education here, that it's about really building that resilience to not only deal with the current impact of COVID it's had so far, but also to deal with the secondary impacts moving forward. And so this is very much at the heart of the teacher preparedness and training package, which we are working with ministries to roll out across the world. But the first step in the module is for really emphasizing the important role of educators and the important role of educators understanding the behaviors in their students, to be able to monitor and recognize signs of distress, to know how to respond to that distress beyond the physical learning experience, to be resourceful in connecting students and parents to specialized resources or services that can help them with that. But first and foremost, to be compassionate and to listen and to learn from those experiences, to recognize the signs, to be compassionate and to be able to respond to it. And to remember that
thank you.
Yeah, hello? Yeah.
Yes, please wrap up, thank you.
Yeah, so the other important element of it is what does it mean for the learning experience itself? And we all know that if mentally teachers are having stresses at home or in the work environment and students are not in the right mind frame because of the impact of these stresses either at home or in schools, then it inhibits the ability to both teach but also to learn. So it's important to deal with that. The other thing which it does is also looks at issues around violence in schools. I mean, UNICEF has carried out surveys indicating that violence in the home and even in this region can be as much as a prevalence of 80%. So with COVID, what we've seen is an exacerbation of these incidents and an increase in reports of violence, both at home and elsewhere. and also online. So what we try to do with the teacher preparedness and training package is to really look at those key elements of teacher, learner, student, and the entire system, and try to build that resilience, to build skills, to recognize and address their own distress, as well as to help others manage their own distress and also any experiences of violence. And so it provides a wealth of material. So perhaps I'll leave it there. But anyway, I can share.
Thank you so much.
I'm happy to share it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's very important that we share the training package that you mentioned. You know, it will be very, very useful, easy for our stakeholders. Thank you. Thank you. Next, I would like to call on Ms. Hana Yoshimoto. As Chief of Education at the Regional Bureau for Education, you and your team are involved in some of the most complex education emergencies in the world, including in Palestine, Iraq, and Syria. In Yemen, insecurity and conflict are now compounded by the COVID crisis and school closures. My question is, could you tell us a little bit more about how conflict and insecurity have affected access to quality inclusive education in that country? And what kinds of measures are education stakeholders and authorities putting in place during COVID-19 closures to ensure teachers remain in the workforce and continue to be able to reach children and youth? The floor is yours, Ms. Yoshimoto.
Sure. Thank you so much, Danny, and thank you so much for allowing me to participate in this great event. So when it comes to countries like Yemen, while we want to enhance the quality of education, the access to schooling still remains a challenge. The basic human rights to education is still being challenged. The education process in Yemen was largely affected by the civil war since March 2015, leaving the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, as UNDP announced in 2017. Nearly 80% of the population is in need of humanitarian or protection aid, including an estimated 7.4 million children. And just to note that 53% of the population are severely food insecure, and 2 million children under the age of 5 require treatment for acute malnutrition. And so this has very serious, grave impact on children's rights to access to quality education. And the UN assessment confirmed that over 2,000 schools are simply not fit for purpose due to physical damage caused by the conflict or a presence of armed groups. And what's worrying is that, so this has left increase in the number of out-of-school children to about 2 million children. And what's worrying is that this number has increased over the years and now reaching 4.7 million children that are in need of assistance to access education. And as you can imagine, even if the schools are open, sort of safe to open and undamaged, their operation is hampered due to the inadequate basic resources. The families are often concerned about the safety of children and any danger that children may face on their way to school. So the vulnerable population, everybody is vulnerable, especially the ethnic minorities, girls, IDPs, children in rural communities, and are typically less likely to attend, even before the current armed conflict. And we talked about a targeted approach earlier, but children with disabilities is basically invisible because of no solid data. So in terms of inclusivity, it's really a hard context. Not only the teachers are in short, but not only the insufficient number of teachers, but interruption of salaries is truly a huge problem, where about 60% of the education staff is not paid. As a matter of fact, on 5th of October, on the occasion of World Teachers Day, UNESCO, along with GPE, Education Cannot Wait, and UNICEF, published a joint statement to support 160,000 teachers and administrative staff that are not paid since 2016. The low school attendance among girls is also a long-standing problem. I've shown you some of the data here, where the percentage of girls enrollment in primary stage, as well as the out-of-school population have deteriorated. When it comes to government spending also, you can see to 2012, it was the government spending on per student was $71. Now it's not even $1. And also the number of days, the number of hours during school day have decreased. When it comes to what I forgot to emphasize in this page on this PowerPoint is that the children really struggle with the psychological impact with the war, with the COVID, of course, and hunger and malnutrition, which really impacts both the access as well as the actual learning. So in this respect, the conflict and insecurity have significantly negatively affected the access to quality education, let alone inclusive education in the country. When it comes to the COVID-19 impact, as you can imagine, the tragic condition that Yemen is experiencing have further deteriorated the situation. It's facing destructive economic and social repercussions. Just like any other countries, Yemen also closed all the schools until further notice, either postponed or cancelled exams. And unfortunately, about 50 schools in the country have been used for quarantine spots. The effects on the socio-economic and psychological aspects that children now face is a situation where they've never experienced before. And it's really also related to the economic impact. Earlier, I talked about non-payment of teachers' salaries since 2016. These teachers were really relying on the remittances from their relatives overseas. With the pandemic, the interruption.
Please prepare to wrap up. Thank you. Please prepare to wrap up. Thank you.
So the interruption of transferring the remittances from over 1 million diasporas and immigrants inside and outside of the country has affected the families and the teachers. The national plan for COVID-19 in education has been developed. However, the follow-up, the actual implementation of it is frankly very weak. There's some measures that's been put in place. However, overall, the support to teachers really remain the key element. While they're the backbone of the education system, if they're not paid, they're just simply not going to teach in schools. So many of the partners are still just simply asking for both technical and financial assistance, simply to keep the education system going, to avoid collapse overall. So that's the grave situation right now.
Thank you, Hannah. I mean, very grim statistics there, and really we need to work together, especially with the international community and agencies, to make sure that this situation doesn't prolong. Thank you very much. I would now like to call Dr. Ahmed Al-Emadi. Mr. Al-Emadi, inclusive education approaches to teaching aim to connect classroom and life experiences in problem-solving activities and require teachers to make a range of learning options available to all, not just some students. Studies undertaken for the Global Education Monitoring Report indicate that many teachers feel they cannot respond to the challenge of diversity in the classroom. In your opinion, what can universities do to better prepare young teaching graduates to identify, understand, and support the range of different learners they will come across over the course of their careers? Do we need to review education degree curricula in light of the shift to remote learning modalities, which may become the new norm in the Gulf states? The floor is yours.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. شكرا على إتاحة الفرصة وأشكر جميع المشاركين على الحضور. لا شك بالنسبة لسؤالك داني، يعني أنا أعتقد أهم حاجة في إعداد النظام الشامل المعلم الشامل هو أنا أعتقد المدرس في أساس العملية التعليمية اللي هي الريسورسز والكوريكولم والستاف أو المدرسين تحديداً. أنا أعتقد هو الأساس، يجب التركيز على إعداد المعلم، اللي هو طبعا احنا الجهة الوحيدة في قطر اللي نخرج أو نعد مدرسين لجميع المراحل من الروضة إلى المرحلة الثانوية. فدورنا كبير جدا. أنا أعتقد مسؤولية كبيرة جدا تتحمل مؤسسات التعليم العالي فعلا مسؤولية توفير الفرص للطلاب المدرسين خريجي الجامعات لتطوير المهارات المختلفة المتعددة. أنا أعتقد يعني من الأشياء المهمة جدا يمكن أنتوني ماكدونالدز ذكر اللي هو الكواليتيز اوف انكلوسيف تيتشر. يجب احنا فعلا احنا في كلية التربية لأن احنا عندنا اعتماد أكاديمي من مؤسسة كيب، وطبعا نكتب تقارير كثيرة إسبا وغيرها. جزء منه يتكلم عن الديفرنشيشن اللي هو اختلاف أو التنوع، لكن في الإسبا أو في كيب ما في كلمة الانكلوجن مش مذكورة تماما، لكن عوضا عنها موجودة كلمة الديفرنشيشن. فاحنا في هذا الصدد فعلا برامجنا كلها عندنا تقريبا 12 برنامج من للمرحله الابتدائيه والثانويه اعداد المدرسين. احنا نركز على 3 ابعاد رئيسيه في الاعداد اللي هو البعد الادراكي والعاطفي والسايكوموتور الحركي. فعلا انا اعتقد على اساس نقدر يعني يكون عندنا مدرس بهذا المستوى، يعني على عجاله نذكر بعض النقاط اللي نركز عليها. على سبيل المثال في البعد الادراكي او الكوجنيتيف دومين يجب ان المدرس يعرف الكونسبتس بالنسبه للانكلوسيف اديوكيشن. شنو مفهوم الانكلوسيف اديوكيشن او التعليم الشامل؟ كل طالب فعلا يستطيع التعلم في تعطي فرصه ويكون يحصل كل طالب ان نعده انه يستطيع بالتالي لما يتخرج يكون حق لكل طالب يكون في عنده كواليتي اديوكيشن، يحصل على كواليتي اديوكيشن. ايضا من الاشياء اللي احنا نعده فيها فعلا يتعرف على المبادئ اللي تحكم التعليم الشامل، السياسات الحكوميه في هذا الصدد، خصائص الطلبه اللي عندهم تحديات سواء كانت بدنيه، عقليه، عاطفيه، اجتماعيه الى اخره، يعني كيف يستطيع فعلا يواجههم في مكان واحد. يعني هذا من اصعب الانواع التدريس او النوعيه موجوده، يعني مش مدارس خاصه او مدارس فيها دمج. هذه الانكلوجن فيها كل الانواع، القدرات، الاثنيات، كل شيء موجود في مكان واحد. فلذلك فعلا احنا دورنا كبير في مؤسسات اعداد المدرسين في التعليم العالي ان ننتبه لهالنقاط هذه، ان فعلا المدرس يستطيع يلم باستراتيجيات تعليم مختلفه تصلح لجميع الفئات، ويعرف ايضا متى يستخدم هالاستراتيجيات. ايضا من الاشياء المهمه جدا ان احنا نوفر له ايضا يكون اطلاع على مصادر التعلم، ان من وين يقدر يجيبها، وايضا يكون عنده قدره كبيره على التقييم، لان تدرون في الانكلوجن هذه كل طالب له احتياجات خاصه، وبالتالي ما ينفع نوع واحد من التقييم. بالتالي احنا مهم جدا ان نخليه يطلع على جميع انواع التقييم سواء كانت evaluation او الاسسمنت، وبالتالي يستطيع في نفس الوقت يختار لكل طالب نوع التقييم اللي يتناسب مع احتياجات هذا الطالب. البعد الثاني البعد العاطفي اللي هو affective
Dr. Al-Imadi, please prepare to wrap up. Thank you.
Okay, just 1 minute please.
Thank you.
فعلا يكون عنده توجه ايجابي نحو التعليم الشامل، عنده حساسيه نحو معرفه احتياجات الطلبه، يكون عنده ثقه فعلا انه يواجه كل انواع التفاعلات هذه في الفصل، يكون متعاطف مع الطالب، يكون empathetic، يكون reflective، يعني يكون cheerful مثلا، يكون فعلا مرح، يعرف بالذات مع الطلبه المعاقين، يخلق بيئه صفيه فعلا مناسبه للتعليم للجميع. والبعد الاخير اللي طبعا المهاره والحركه سايكوموتر دومين، فعلا يكون عنده قدره على الملاحظه، يستطيع التعامل مع فئات كثيره، يتعاون يتواصل بشكل ممتاز مع الزملاء، يستطيع استخدام وسائل تعليميه مختلفه، يستخدم استراتيجيات وطرق تدريس متنوعه ومختلفه. هذه يعني بعجاله احنا ايش نسوي في ناحيه الاعداد بالنسبه لاعداد المدرس الشامل في جميع المراحل في كليه التربيه. شكرا جزيلا. Thank you, Danny.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Imadi. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to call on Dr. Ziad Najm. Dr. Ziyad, the KFAS Academy has begun a new collaboration with the government to enable students to continue learning during school closures, and is now playing a key supporting role in the transition to a digital and distance education system. We know that the shift to remote learning can have the effect of excluding and marginalizing some students. Could you elaborate on what you think are the most common challenges for remote learning in terms of catering to learners with diverse learning styles and needs? And what are some recent educational technological innovations that are available and suitable for learners in the Gulf states? Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you for the question, and thank you for all the agencies involved in the organization. Before I start, let me clarify just one thing. The effort of KFAS Academy is not working with the government. It is KFAS is a private sector. It keeps the government informed of all the activities that it's doing. And the idea that we came up with is that learning should never stop. So if formal education is not possible, then any form of informal or non-formal education has to be provided, and has to be provided very quickly until formal education is up and ready to run. So this is the effort that KFAS Academy has done. We work in digital and distance learning environment. So we were able to bring up a coalition of private companies that had content available for the Kuwaiti curriculum and put it all available for students for free throughout the lockdown until the schools were up. I agree with you, of course, with the question that moving into technology might exclude some students, and I will be addressing those and how we can work about it towards the end. But I would like first to bring that technology also allows excluded children to be included. So while most of your invited speakers talked about excluded children, let's talk a little bit about children whom we'll be able to include when we move to digital learning and electronic learning. And these are basically your average learner. Just because the child goes to school doesn't mean they're able to learn through the formal ways of education that addresses the average. So learners who weren't able to catch up with the average pace of instruction, once we move to digital learning, these learners have better chances in the asynchronous learning environments compared to the synchronous. This group is actually quite large. It's considered, if you consider that the aptitude of students towards subject is not uniform. You might be excellent in math, but you're suffering in biology or humanities, etc. So you might require more time to grasp it. If we go back in time, synchronous learning was the only way available, was the only option that is available, because the learner and the teacher had to be in the same place at the same time. So the only form of learning was synchronous learning. However, with the introduction of printed books, and then centuries later with the introduction of broadcasting, TV and radio, etc., distance learning became into existence. And now with the internet becoming a household utility, then two-way communication is now available between the learner and the facilitator, and the circle is now complete and all the elements are available. However, what we should be focusing now is how do you transition the teaching process from synchronous in-place learning, in which supposedly we know how to do, into distance and asynchronous kind of learning. My worry is that because schools had to jump to this new norm unprepared because of course of what happened with the pandemic, it might result in a backlash once things are back to normality, especially if we don't do it right. Let me just, if you allow me, just let me put it this way.
Please prepare to wrap up. Thank you. And you're also breaking the sound, so please, thank you.
Okay. So let me just summarize it this way. If you go back to normal education without any changes, then you have failed in implementing distance learning. The challenges are fourfold, and most of your speakers have addressed them. The number one challenge is actually the resistance to change from all stakeholders: parents, students, teachers, education systems. Of course, there are technology-related challenges, and there is the pedagogical challenges of how do you adapt to this new medium. What Gulf countries in specific needs to address is what's happening on the home front. I don't see Gulf countries or education systems addressing the new role of the home front, whether from the infrastructure, as infrastructure providers, as learning facilitators, and as technology problem solvers. With that, I conclude, and I thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ziad. I think, really, as you said, technology can also be used to, of course, include the excluded. Thank you very much. We'll have more questions for you later. I'd like to call on now Ms. Amna Al-Balushi. Ms. Al-Balushi, according to the GEM report, Oman is one of the 10 countries with the largest positive trend towards enrolling children in pre-primary education, alongside countries such as the Philippines and Australia. This is great news because ensuring all children are prepared and ready to enter school is an important part of reducing inequality. Could you elaborate on the Ministry of Education's policies with regard to early childhood education in Oman? And could you also explain how the country has managed to improve enrollment rates so considerably in recent years? The floor is yours. Thank you. Please unmute your mic. Thank you.
شكرا. بداية أسعد الله صباحكم، وبداية أحب أن أشكر الزملاء في اللجنة الوطنية والقطرية للتربية والثقافة والعلوم، وفي مكتب اليونسكو أيضا في الدوحة، على تنظيم هذا اللقاء الهام. للرد على هذا السؤال، هناك اهتمام كبير ودعم متواصل من الحكومة العمانية لهذه الفئة المهمة. طبعا هذه الفئة هناك صار في تغيير في المشاريع والسياسات والقوانين المقدمة لهذه الفئة بشكل كبير جدا. طبعا هناك إيمان من حكومة السلطنة بأن الاستثمار في الطفولة لا يسهم فقط في تكوين رأس المال البشري، ولكن أيضا في التنمية الاقتصادية والاجتماعية للمجتمع العماني بشكل عام. هناك دراسة تحليلية لوضع المرأة والطفل قام بها المركز الوطني للإحصاء والمعلومات في السلطنة، أثبتت بأن هناك بالفعل ازدياد متسارع في تقديم خدمات الطفولة المبكرة في عمان، نظرا للتسهيلات اللي قامت فيها حكومة السلطنة فيما يخص القوانين والسياسات المنظمة لهذه العمل مع هذه الفئة. ربما يأتي على رأس هذه الجهود إصدار قانون الطفل في عام 2014 بمرسوم سلطاني. مع إصدار هذا القانون أصبح هناك مظلة تشريعية تضمن بأن جميع الأطفال في سلطنة عمان يتمتعون بنفس الحقوق. إضافة إلى ذلك فقد مثل هذا القانون تغيير محوري في تنظيم عمل العديد من مؤسسات الدولة ومؤسسات المجتمع المدني والقطاع الخاص المعنية بالطفل. من أبرز ما جاء في هذا القانون بشكل سريع أنه يجب أن يتمتع كل طفل بعدم التمييز وبحرية التعبير، تطوير القدرات، الحقوق المدنية، الحقوق الصحية، الحقوق الاجتماعية والتعليمية والثقافية والاقتصادية. كما كفل أيضا هذا القانون، قانون الطفل العماني، حقوق الأطفال ذوي الإعاقة وحمايتهم من العنف والاستغلال. هناك أيضاً العديد من المبادرات التي تهدف إلى توحيد الجهود الوطنية وتكريسها لهذا الاهتمام بقطاع الطفولة، مثل الاستراتيجية الوطنية للطفولة، أيضاً استراتيجية العمل الاجتماعي. وهنا عندنا في سلطنة عمان تعتبر وزارة التنمية الاجتماعية هي المسؤولة عن خدمات رعاية الطفل المقدمة للأطفال لحد سن 3 سنوات. أيضاً تقوم بتطبيق اتفاقيات حقوق الطفل، مراقبة برامج الأطفال ذوي الإعاقة. أيضاً هناك وزارات أخرى معنية برعاية وتعليم الطفولة المبكرة، على سبيل المثال وزارة التعليم العالي وجامعة السلطان قابوس هما يعني الشريكان الرئيسيان في تدريب المعلمين لهذه الفئة. كذلك وزارة التجارة لها دور مهم في هذا الجانب، وهو إجراء الترخيص والائتمان وتقديم التسهيلات للمستثمرين في مجال من القطاع الخاص بهذا المجال. بالنسبة لوزارة التربية والتعليم، هي تعمل بشكل كبير مع وزارة التنمية الاجتماعية بالإشراف والدعم الفني لتحسين التعليم ورعاية هذه الفئة، أيضاً بالتعاون والشراكة مع الجهات المعنية الأخرى. هنا نتحدث ليس فقط عن مؤسسات الدولة الحكومية، وإنما أيضاً القطاعين الخاص، القطاع العام، وأيضاً التعاون مع المنظمات الدولية المعنية بالطفولة كمنظمة اليونيسيف، والتي تتعاون بشكل كبير مع المؤسسات هنا في تنفيذ البرامج والمبادرات المختلفة. حتى يعني إحنا في فترة جائحة كورونا كان هناك العديد من المبادرات اللي نفذتها السلطنة مع منظمة اليونيسيف للأطفال ذوي الإعاقة بالذات. يعني هذا التعاون الكبير مع هذه المنظمات مع هذه الجهات كان هدفه زيادة فرص الحصول على التعليم
Okay, thank you very much. I think we'll just stop there. Thank you very much, Ms. Al-Balushi. Unfortunately, I think we have a technical problem. And anyway, time is up, so we'll go to the next, the final speaker then. Mr. Abdullah Mansouri. One of the focus areas of the QCDC is ensuring that students are prepared to enter the workforce after they complete their formal education. The GEM report highlights that young people with disabilities face additional challenges securing gainful employment, and marginalized students need tailored programs to support their university experience, including orientation, study and life skills training, mentoring, workplace preparation, and psychosocial support. In your view, what more could the Gulf states be doing in this area? And does there need to be greater collaboration and commitment from relevant ministries such as education, labor and youth, and private sector actors to ensure vulnerable learners are ready and supported to work? The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Thanks a lot. طيب، بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين. شاكر لكم الاستضافة الكريمة. طبعا احنا مركز قطر للتطوير المهني، عضو مؤسسة قطر للتربية والعلوم تنمية المجتمع، نعمل تحت مظلة قطاع تنمية المجتمع في المؤسسة. نهدف إلى دعم وإرشاد وتوجيه الشباب على أساس أنه يتم اختيار أفضل نقول المهن اللي تناسبهم وتناسب وتتماشى مع احتياجات سوق العمل في دولة قطر، وندعمهم وندعم كل من يساعد في هذا القرار وهذا المسار. هذا باختصار عن المركز. طبعا احنا نلاحظ لله الحمد الارشاد والتوجيه المهني ركن اساسي للربط بين مخرجات التعليم وبين احتياجات سوق العمل وطبعا قدرات الشباب. وشهدت المنطقة الخليج بصفة عامة وقطر بصفة خاصة تطور ملحوظ في الإرشاد والتوجيه المهني مؤخرا، خاصة من خلال المدارس أو البرامج الموجودة في المدارس والجامعات، مما انعكس إيجابا مع تطور الموارد البشرية بصفة عامة. على الرغم من هذا التطور إلا أنه ما زال في مراحله الأولى، ويحتاج المزيد من السياسات والاستراتيجيات على المستوى الوطني لتعميم الفائدة على كافة الفئات ذات العلاقة، وبالخصوص الفئة اللي احنا نتكلم عنها ذوي الاحتياجات الخاصة، سواء من خلال البرامج اللي تقدم لهم في المدارس والجامعات أو التعليم المستمر بعد انخراطهم في سوق العمل. طبعا تعد دولة قطر ولله الحمد من الدول التي لا يوجد فيها نطاق تهميشي للطلبة، وذلك لأن الدولة تتبنى سياسات واضحة فيما يتعلق بالمدارس غير الحكومية. نتكلم عن المدارس الخاصة، مدارس الجاليات، المدارس الخاصة والمدمجة لذوي الاحتياجات الخاصة. وأيضا ندلل على هذا الأمر انعقاد مؤتمر الدوحة الدولي للإعاقة والتنمية الذي عقد في 7 و8 من شهر ديسمبر 2019 تحت رعاية كريمة مصاحبة السمو الشيخة موزة بنت ناصر، ومشاركة دولية واسعة في هذا المؤتمر. بصفة عامة في كثير من البرامج المساعدة في مجال التوجيه والإرشاد تقدم في الدولة، وأخص مثلا بالذكر برنامج الابتعاث اللي تقدمه اللي تديره وزارة التعليم والتعليم العالي، ويشارك فيه معظم الجهات الحكومية والعامة في الدولة. ولكن على أساس نتكلم عن التحديات اللي موجودة اليوم لذوي الاحتياجات الخاصة وانخراطهم في سوق العمل، نتكلم على سبيل المثال أن هذا البرنامج يعني لم يشمل هذه الفئات أو ما كان في بعض الفئات المشملة، مما يضعنا عن مجموعة من التحديات الصراحة يواجهونها ذوي الاحتياجات الخاصة لانخراطهم في سوق العمل. على سبيل المثال عدم تحديد أنواع ومستويات الإعاقة وربطها بنوعيات التعليم المطلوبة لكل فئة، عدم تحديد لنوعية التعليم المناسب من حيث البرامج والمدارس المتخصصة لكل فئة إعاقة. طبعا في قصور في التوعية بدور أولياء الأمور في التشخيص المبكر للإعاقة وربطها بالاحتياجات التعليمية الخاصة بكل طالب، قلة المدارس التي تقدم تعليما فاعلا لذوي الاحتياجات الخاصة وتشمل المدارس المدمجة والمدارس المتخصصة ومدارس المناطق خارج نقول المدن، عدم وجود إطار عام على المستوى الوطني للتوجيه والإرشاد المهني يخدم كافة فئات ذوي الاحتياجات الخاصة، عدم وجود تنسيق واضح بين دور الجهات المنظمة والشركاء في تخطيط وتنظيم برامج الإعداد المهني لفئات ذوي الاحتياجات الخاصة، عدم سهولة الحصول على المعلومات موثقة من جهة مركزية عن البرامج والجهات الداعمة لذوي الاحتياجات الخاصة. طبعا أتكلم أنا من وجهة مما يعانيه الأسر أو ذوي الإعاقة. أضف إلى كل هذه التحديات تحدي الآن اللي احنا نواجهه، تحدي جائحة كورونا والظروف اللي حاطت بكل نقول الطلبة العاديين أو الأسر العادية، فما بالكم الأسر من لديهم ظروف في حالة وجود أحد الاحتياجات الخاصة. طبعا هذه التحديات قد أقدم مجموعة من المقترحات أو للحلول. طبعا احنا نعمل على بعض هذه المقترحات الآن ساري العمل أو جاري العمل عليها، وبعضها الآن إن شاء الله تعالى نبحث عن شركاء جداد لتنفيذها. نتكلم عن مقترحات نحتاج تصميم وتنفيذ إطار عام لإرشاد والتوجيه المهني لفئات ذوي الاحتياجات الخاصة على مستوى الدولة من قبل فريق متخصص يهدف إلى تسهيل انخراطهم بسوق العمل والإضافة قيمة اقتصادية في المجتمع. طبعا عمل دليل يوضح دور الشركاء الرئيسيين والفرعيين أو الثانويين للطلبة وأسرهم والجهات المعنية بتعليمهم وتدريبهم وتوظيفهم. إن شاء الله. أوكي. وعمل منصة بغرض زيادة تواصل تعريف برامج والأنشطة التي تقدمها الجهات ذات العلاقة بتعليم وتدريب الأطفال، تكييف واستخدام أفضل نماذج الممارسات الدولية لإرشاد وتوجيه الطلبة المرتبطة بذوي الاحتياجات الخاصة في جهات التعليم والأعمال المختلفة في دولنا الخليجية، تقديم برامج وحملات توعوية تهدف إلى تعزيز ثقافة الدمج الاجتماعي والمهني لهذه الفئة وأهمية دورها في المجتمع، تبني معايير وطنية لتهيئة بيئة مؤسسات التعليم والعمل لتتناسب فعليا مع احتياجات هذه الفئات على سبيل مواصفات وتصاميم الممرات والأبواب والمصاعد والمرافق الصحية وإجراءات الأمن والسلامة وإلى آخره. ربط البرامج والأنشطة لذوي الاحتياجات الخاصة بتحقيق أهداف استراتيجية للتنميات الوطنية في دول الخليج في جزئياتها المرتبطة بتنمية رأس المال البشري وحماية الاجتماعية وحقوق الإنسان بما يتوافق مع المعاهدات والاتفاقيات الدولية الملتزمة بها معظم دول المنطقة. أكتفي بهنا وأنا على استعداد أجاوب بتفاصيل أكثر. شكرا.
Thank you, Mr. Al-Mansour. You're really right on time. Unfortunately, we really have gone over time, so I'm gonna stop there because we would like to move to the Q&A that is moderated by Dr. Sabah. So over to you. Thank you very much.
نشكر الجميع على الجلسة النقاشية، والآن مع الفاضلة سبأ قاضي من جامعة قطر لعرض الأسئلة ومناقشتها.
Assalamu alaikum. Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Lou. Assalamu alaikum. We have, because of lack of the time, we have a few questions, and the rest of the question is going to be circulated after the webinar. The first question to any one of the panelists, please feel free to answer it. A common call in the area of this pandemic is to build back better. How can the Gulf states take advantage of the crisis to ensure no learner is left behind? Please, 2 to 3 minutes. Any one of the panelists can answer this question.
لو سمحتي دكتورة سبا.
اتفضل دكتور أحمد. دكتور أحمد تفضل.
اي نعم، شكرا دكتورة سبا. أنا أعتقد طبعا جوابا على سؤالك دكتورة، هي مهم جدا طبعا السياسات يعني اللي تنشأ من قبل الحكومات في دول مجلس التعاون مهمة جدا لحفظ حقوق جميع الفئات، إن no child left behind، يعني عرفت شلون؟ فهذه يجب الحكومات تدعم هذه، وأيضا أنا أعتقد المجتمعات من NGOs أدوارها مهمة جدا للتأكد أن فعلا كل طفل يعامل مثل أي، بغض النظر عن جنسيته، عن لونه، عن بشرته، عن ثنيته، يحصل على يعني quality education. وانا اعتقد مثل ما قلت احنا teacher preparation schools مثل جامعه قطر كليه التربيه ايضا دورهم مهم جدا في رسم السياسات. لكن انا اللي اتمنى، يمكن مو بجزء من سؤالك، انا اعتقد من المشاكل الموجوده، انا اتكلم كعميد كليه تربيه، صراحه في جاب كبير بيننا وبين اليونسكو في قطر حتى انا اتكلم. يعني انا من خلال 4 سنوات عميد كليه مره زارونا للاسف، انا اتكلم بكل شفافيه. انا اتمنى ان مثل هالبوليسيز الجديده اللي تجي اول باول يكون في فوكال بوينت بيننا وبينهم، يجون يعني يعطونا دورات، يعطونا اشياء جديده، نعرف طلابنا على الجديد. انا اعتقد هالاشياء تسهل العمليه، عمليه الانتقال الان عن بعد. احنا في كليه التربيه حاليا بصدد يعني طرح اكثر من مقرر فيما يتعلق بالتدريس عن بعد دكتوره. هذا ربما يساعد على جزء من سؤالك ان احنا ايش بنسوي، وايضا بصدد ممكن طرح برنامج دبلوم او ماجستير في شو اسمه instruction technology educational technology design and instruction باذن الله تعالى خلال يمكن 2 او اقل باذن الله تعالى يكون برنامج متاح باذن الله. شكرا.
شكرا يا دكتور أحمد. Thank you Dr. Ahmed. Dr. Ahmed also answered 2 questions from the audience. My question now to to Bilal. Dr. Bilal, Dr. Yahya said the education systems in the Gulf are highly privatized, but this often means non-citizens have to pay more to access education, and that can be a barrier, as you know. Are you able to give some example of what different countries have done to reduce the barriers for non-citizens?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
As you know, the 2019 Global Education Monitoring Report last year dealt specifically with the question of migration and education, including both regular migration, but also refugees and forced migration generally. So there's a lot of material you can find there about concrete ways and best practice examples of how countries reduced barriers for migrants in education. Because you will see that this is generally a problem. In many countries around the world, migrant children are disadvantaged when it comes to education access, to education outcomes. One concrete thing that countries have done, a number of countries have done, is to ensure that schools enroll all children in their area that come to them, and that there are no barriers concerning documentation, for example. There are examples of barriers where to enter school you need to provide proof of residency rights and both birth certificates and so on, and documents that some migrants do not have, especially if their status is unclear. So reducing those kinds of barriers, because that should not be a reason not to get an education. As we say, you know, in this report, all means all. Right? So regardless of your migration status, of your documentation status, you have a right to education. So that is one of the barriers that needs to go, that it's not down to the school to decide you can't come to school because you lack this piece of paper. So that would be one example.
Thank you so much. Thank you. The next question to Dr. Anthony. Parents are struggling right now to cope with the work and responsibility and homeschooling as well. How important is it that parents are involved in their children's education? Mr. Anthony McDonald, did you hear that question? Okay, I'll ask another question. Anyone can answer that question? Dr. Mary? Is Dr. Mary there? Can help us to answer this question?
Thank you very much, Dr. Saba. I shall try to do that. I think that parents from the very beginning are the first educators of their children, and we often don't recognize that. That's where children learn some of the very basic social interactions that will be part and parcel of them for the rest of their lives. And I think sometimes what we do with education, particularly formal education, and one of my colleagues talked a little bit about the need for understanding the different kinds of education, the different modalities, is that we tend to separate the family and the community from the education institution. And we need to build better bridges so that we can actually help parents be better educators and to support their children when they are learning. But the turnaround is also true for many parts of the world. Parents are not well educated, not so much the case in this region, but in other parts of the world. And so the children can also serve to bring different kinds of messages into the family that actually help the rest of the Sustainable Development Goals, such as health and nutrition. So I do believe that the family is critical. It's just understanding that the family's roles are different in different societies, but we can also see the family as part of the fabric around which learning occurs. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. The last question will be in Arabic for Mr. Bilal. I hope Mr. Bilal with us. The question is: ما هي مصدر بيانات التقرير فيما يخص بيانات الإنفاق على التعليم خاصة المتعلقة بدول الخليج؟ ما هي مصدر بيانات التقرير فيما يخص الإنفاق على التعليم في دول الخليج؟ تفضل.
So whenever possible, we use data from the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, the UIS in Montreal, who send a questionnaire to member countries who then provide the data on all of the SDG 4 indicators that are included in the questionnaire. So the expenditure data, the education expenditure data also comes from the UIS. Which means that it may not be the most recent one, or the most recent data that is available at the country level. It depends on what countries reported to the UIS and when they last reported figures to the UIS. And the GDP numbers, they come from standard sources like the IMF.
Thank you, Mr. Bilal, and thank you for everyone who asked questions. Accept our apology because of the timing. The questions will be, the answer will be circulated after this webinar. Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
نشكر الدكتورة سبأ القاضي على عرض ومناقشة الأسئلة. وأخيراً سننتقل إلى الفاضل دانييلو لتقديم عرض حول التقرير بعنوان إعادة البناء بشكل أفضل الخطوات التالية لدول الخليج. فليتفضل. مستر دانييلو. Mr. Danilo, we cannot hear you.
Hello, I'm sorry. I've lost the sound earlier on. So anyway, as I have said earlier, we have unfortunately gone over time. But I just want to make a few remarks before we conclude. We know that, again, throughout the presentations and even the statistics that we have seen, unfortunately, they are quite grim, knowing especially that has been badly impacted by COVID-19. But I think what is important, and I think this is also very evident in all the presentations, is that it's very, very important to reach out to the most vulnerable and the marginalized. And as Dr. Pigosi said, is really to make the invisible visible. I think we all have a role to play in that. The good thing is I can also see a trend, which is a lot of stakeholders are partnering with governments and the private sector to make sure that this happens. And as also Dr. Ziad mentioned earlier, the technology is also there to be used to make sure that we address this main problem. We also have the technology and tools like Anthony has mentioned earlier about the training package. So again, I think I will stop there because we really haven't got much time left, except to say that we really appreciate the presence of His Excellency, the Minister of Education and Higher Education, for his opening remarks. And also we would like to thank our Director, Dr. Anna Paulini, and our keynote speaker, Dr. Bilal Barakat. And of course, all the panelists, all 8 of you, thank you for your contribution to a very fruitful discussion. And we hope to see you again very soon. So with that, I would like to thank everyone and wish you all a very nice day. Thank you.
شكرا. العافية. خلاص يا أحمد، يعني نيجي على الآخر. الحمد لله. على الآخر مش الحال. الحمد لله تمام.
يعطيكم العافية.
يعافيش إن شاء الله. الحمد لله
خلصنا. دكتور يحيى شكرا.
We did it.
Thank you, dear colleagues. Thank you, Dr. Sabah, Dr. Yahya, Hassan, Lola, Nera. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Caitlin, Kazu, and our colleagues at headquarters. Thank you very much.
Thank you. صدقا كل اللي قيل موجود بالورقة. يعطيكم العافية ويعني الأمور طيبة الحمد لله. بارك الله فيكم جميعا.
يعطيك ألف عافية.
شكرا. عافيك يا رب. شكرا شكرا لك.
I would also like to thank the interpreters for their excellent work today and sorry for going over time.
Thank you, everybody. Okay. Bye.